morning, everyone. Hello, hello. Thank you, Anne-Marie, for that lovely introduction. It's always quite funny hearing your own introduction back. And I've just aged out of all the young people bracket stuff, so it's kind of nice to hear that again, actually. Today I am going to be taking you through my Churchill journey and taking you through a research fellowship that took 9 weeks, 19 flights and 3 road trips across the world. And I'm very excited to take you on that journey with me. Before I do any of that though, I would like us to take a moment and for you to indulge me slightly. And so I would love if you could ground yourself, and maybe if you are able, have both feet on the ground. I would love you to have your hands in a rested position, and if you are comfortable, I would like you to close your eyes or at least drop your gaze slightly. So we are on incredibly beautiful Aboriginal country today, and we have been gifted with a lovely, cool day where I've walked out in the morning and had kind of mist cover my body slightly. I grew up on Larrakia country, which is warmth and sun. And so I would like you to step through with me into my family kitchen and take a moment to kind of feel a huge amount of warmth come over your body. And so I'd like you to envision, instead of kind of the dry heat we get down here in this beautiful country, I want you to envision kind of like a humid, wet heat, if you've had that. So it kind of encompasses the body a little bit. And you're sitting down in my kitchen. My kitchen growing up was a very beautiful lime green colour. And you are surrounded by, for me, the generations of incredible women in my family. So I want you to envision there's children that run around your feet and kind of disturb your pants or skirt or dress. You know, they kind of make everything shuffle a little bit. I want you to envision the kind of teenage arguments happening just kind of away from you that are getting loud and heated but full of love and care. And then I want you to, as you're sitting down in this kitchen, envision all of my aunties coming and giving you a warm plate of food. You did not ask for it. You've actually told them you're not hungry. It's actually not about you. And so you are getting put multiple things in front of you to eat and consume. There is loudness and there is this energy that can be mildly overwhelming, but for all of you, I want you to sit for it in a moment and actually acknowledge that the loud, the big, the huge energy that you're experiencing is the community, is my family. And so I want to acknowledge my family and my tribe, the Karadara mob, and where I grew up, which is Larrakia country. And thank you all for stepping into my kitchen with me. You can open your eyes now. Thank you so much. I'm a walker, hence this, because like standing over here, and I've actually written things, which I never do, so I will have to come back here at some point. But before we get into kind of the Churchill and the journey, Anne-Marie, you've done an incredible job, thank you, of kind of listing the professional side of my life. But to do this work and to kind of step you into the fellowship that I did, I actually need to introduce you in a very different way. So I, as I said, am a Karadara woman. So if you're unaware of where Karadara country kind of is, it's near Broome in WA. And so I have Aboriginal, Chinese, Japanese heritage in my family, which is very common in Darwin, less common in Victoria, I must admit. And so I grew up surrounded by my family. So I am the eldest child, and I'm the eldest child to one sister, who is my sister Hannah, who is my younger sister. I'm the oldest child of my mother, Rebecca French, and my father, Ken French. My mother is the 4th child of my grandparents, Florence and Eric Lee. And so I grew up surrounded by family. I grew up with my auntie Andrea, my auntie Debbie, my uncle Marcus, my auntie Narelle, and my auntie Erica. And out of the 7 of them, I grew up surrounded by cousins that we all went to the same school together. And actually when I got to high school, one of the first things my 1-year older cousin did when I got into high school was like, here are all of the people you're related to at this school. Try not to make out with any of them. And in Darwin, it was like, okay, so there's like 6 boys that all have the same surname. You're related to 5 of them. Maybe just don't kiss any of them, just in case. But I was incredibly blessed to grow up in a household where I lived with my mum, my dad, my sister, and my grandfather. And even though it was my house, technically, it was Poppy's house. It was my grandfather's house. And it was the same house that my mother grew up in and all of her siblings grew up in. They grew up in a 2-story house. Post-Cyclone Tracy, I grew up in a 1-story house. Particularly fun. But I grew up always seeing an incredible example of intergenerational learning and strength. And even though we were in some ways disconnected culturally through our part of the stolen generation, and the fact that my nana was taken from Karadara country and taken through Beagle Bay Mission and ended up in Darwin. So she was removed when she was 5. And so because of that, we grew up disconnected from cultural community in WA, but because she married into Larrakia family up in Darwin, as I tend to find across Australia, mob find a way of finding mob, and we find a way of finding community and connection wherever we are. And so I was incredibly lucky to grow up in that space in Darwin. And then when I finished up high school and I was going to uni, as most people do, and kind of similarly I find sometimes when I go and do rural regional work, a lot of young people will move to big cities to go to university because we want to experience the trains and trams. I went to the Amaya for the first time when I moved to university. It seemed too big, honestly. And so when I came down here, I started working, after I finished my degree, I started volunteering and then working with Body Safety Australia. And so I've spent the past 8 years working around sexual violence prevention in primary prevention spaces. I love hearing strategic plans that are about, end of sentence. But I love actually hearing strategic plans that are acknowledging the fact that reactive responses cannot be our entire focus. And while they play a hugely important role, actually how we do preventative work and how we scaffold and set things up so that it's actually about health and empowerment. And health, obviously, this room, you all are aware that health is beyond just disease prevention, but actually about going, what are the kind of lives we want people to live? What are the kind of opportunities we want people to have? And so that's why when I was doing the work, when I started doing work with Body Safety Australia, it was about how do we create spaces for young people that we can go, what are we aiming for? So much of prevention is going, we don't want you to be harmed, we don't want you to be abused, we don't want you to be assaulted, and I'm sure we all agree of that, but actually going, what are we aiming for? What is the thing we're striving towards? And that's where I always go, I want all young people, I want us all to have equitable, respectful relationships and experiences. I want you to be empowered to have those experiences, and I want pleasure to be part of that conversation. And so to do that for us, we go into schools and services to do that primary prevention education. Now, whenever you're doing something that is about primary prevention, you are inevitably going to come face to face with intervention. Because when you go in and particularly for us, when we work with schools, so often schools and services and communities that want to get us in when it is palatable for the adults for us to be there. And so what that means is they decide, yep, so we want you to speak to the year 12s, because it's finally time that we can talk about sex with them. Great. And so while we can still do incredible work in that space when we're talking about preventing harm, preventing violence, often we are working in spaces where most of the students have experienced violence or have perpetrated violence. And so when we walk into those spaces, we have to go, yes, we're trying to prevent future harm, but actually in talking about preventing future harm, you have to acknowledge and actually deal with the fact that everyone sitting in that room has experienced harm. That the teachers that I'm working with are coming up to me going, 2 of my students, one has assaulted the other on the weekend. How do I keep both of those students safe in my classroom? As well as doing all the other things teachers have to do. And so when we started doing this work, and when I started doing this work, I kind of continuously was coming up against this idea of, we're doing prevention, we're doing this kind of response, but what is the support when we talk about sexual violence, particularly for young people, particularly for peer-on-peer sexual violence? And I was quite kind of shocked the first time it happened to me when I had a disclosure of peer-on-peer sexual violence in the classroom. Because even though we'd just gone through what consent means, even though we just went through things around sexual violence, I had a young person come up to me and go, yeah, but I didn't say no, therefore it's not really rape, right? And in that conversation that we had together, when this young person was like, okay, but if it was rape, what do I do? And having to tell a young person their options makes you feel small, because those options are not particularly exciting, they're not particularly inviting, they don't particularly scream of justice or healing or support, and they're very limiting. And so when you're talking to a student and going, yeah, cool, so like we can go through your school and you can go through these kind of reporting services at your school, we can go through police and we can go through a carceral option. And when you're looking at a young person who's just about to go through their VCE exams and going, I want nothing to do with that. And often the response you get is that it? Like, is that my whole options for what I have to do now? Basically a carceral response, a one-on-one counselling, or absolutely nothing. Not to say those aren't great in their own right, but so often that young person goes, that's not the response I want. That's not doing the thing I want it to do. And so often the response a young person then has is, well, I'm not going to do anything. And that doesn't give any healing in response to that young person. It actually also does not help in any way, shape or form the young person who has done harm. There is no accountability, there is no learning, there is no healing, there is no prevention of harm in the future, because we can't do anything in the present. And so I spent kind of 8 years continuously coming back to this problem and going there, like, there has to be another solution. And the reason I kept coming back to this idea that there had to be another solution was because I've seen it. I've seen other solutions, and I've seen them in that kitchen with my family. When we look into First Nations knowledge and Indigenous ways of being, and we look at how community plays role, I know Indigenous knowledge, I was like, there is a link here of understanding of ancient practice and wisdom that is so not being utilised. And it's not being utilised because in Australia, Indigenous people are always seen through a deficit lens. So anytime I, as an Aboriginal person, stand up and talk about health or well-being or education, often the idea is that I'm going to talk about the gap, and that I'm going to talk about the issues in community. And often if I go into a space like this or others, maybe not like this, maybe in some other conference spaces, where I'm talking about what I do, the response often is, oh, well, you know, you've got to go to Alice Springs and help them out. And you've got to go to this community and help them out. Oh, and I heard this awful story the other day about, and everyone just wants to talk about this idea of deficit and problem, that Aboriginal people are a problem that needs solving. I'm not a big fan of that view, surprisingly. And so I wanted to talk about, okay, well, actually, how do we flip this and acknowledge the fact that, no, it's not about a problem, it's about going, Indigenous people have solutions and have answers and have generations of ways of being that actually just is outside of a Western institutional model. And that does not make it bad. That does not make it worse. That does not make it less legitimate. But it's outside of a Western scope. And so when I was going, look, I have this like problem over here, these ideas over here, I need like something to fund, doing something with this piece of work. And that's how I ended up applying and getting a Churchill Fellowship. If we're unfamiliar with a Churchill Fellowship, as I was until I started looking into it, so this is through the Winston Churchill Trust. Yes. Doing a piece of Indigenous research through a colonial institution is a vibe. That took a minute. But what I actually did was I looked into it and went, okay, so there's some incredible Indigenous people that have done work through this fellowship. And what it enables you to do is do research. I know I'm in a university right now. But it enables you to do research outside of university or classic Western institutional spaces that have very clear ideas about what is successful and what knowledge success looks like. And I didn't want to do research like that. I wanted to do Indigenous-led research that had methodology that was Indigenous, that acknowledged how we as people gather and share, and didn't put restrictions around what I would have done through Western institutions, like amazing universities. And so this is how I came here. Now, also though, to do that, I did protocol and I went through my elders and went, this is what I want to do, this is the space that I could possibly do it through. Is that okay? How do we feel? How does that sit? Because it is it's the Winston Churchill Trust. And I had one of my uncles sit me down, Uncle Glenn, and go, like, Lauren, you want to do this incredible piece of work, like you're telling me they're going to, you can go around the world, you can do all these sort of things. And he just went, so are they going to pay? Are they going to give you the money? And I was like, yeah. And he goes, cool. So take the white man money and do some cool black deadly things and come back and work with community. So that's what I did. And so that's how I got to this kind of very long title of doing this research, because even though it's not a Western institution, you still have to kind of sound like it's a bit of a Western institution at first. And so that's how we got here, which is my research. My intention was to study Indigenous elder-guided relationship and community repair around healing, around youth sexual violence. And it was that particularly, because that's what I had seen in my kitchen, was that intergenerational connection of going, here are the elders in community, here are the knowledge holders, and here's how they connect with young people, and here is how that knowledge and respect is shared through. Now, obviously in colonised spaces, like Australia, there's been so much work to make sure that our intergenerational connections have been fractured and severed, and honestly, they did it really well. But there are so many young people, myself, my family, my cousins, our young mobs of generations, who are doing so much work to try and reconnect that. And in doing that, we do incredible work here, but I also knew that to be able to get work into really try to move the dial from that deficit lens, I really went, okay, well, if this has a global backing, if we can put some global weight to it, because we love to do that in any kind of space. And often whenever you're in a country, you always look at other countries and go, well, they must be doing it incredibly well. Not all countries, but some. And so that's when I then came back to this idea of, okay, well, if I travelled around, if I spoke to other Indigenous people globally and showed that this is not just even an Australian thing, this is an Indigenous thing across the globe, of knowledge sharing, of this intergenerational healing, well then that can bring weight to this work here. That can help shift this understanding and dial of problem, and it means we can kind of remove this idea that Aboriginal people are just the problem when we talk about sexual violence, and actually go, well no, we have space of solution. And so that's why I applied to do this work and to do this piece of research. And so I travelled over, as I said, 9 weeks, 19 flights, 3 road trips. Honestly, wouldn't recommend doing it that way. That is far too many flights. But I started in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I moved on to Turtle Island in both Canada and the United States, and then I finished up at the Sami Parliament in Norway. And so I'm going to take us through what I did and what I learnt, and also knowing that as great as a keynote space is, I'm not going to get through the entirety of what I did. And that's why I've written a report that you can read later. Okay, so New Zealand was where I started my research. It was where I discovered how to create a culturally safe space for yarning, because I really wanted, as I said, to do Indigenous methodology research, which meant I did not go in with recording devices, I did not go in with surveys, I did not go in with even a prompted list of questions. I had one prompted question I asked everyone. But what I did was similarly to how I set this up today with you. I met people and presented myself. I presented my line, I presented my story, I presented my family's story, and I then, after I had presented myself as an individual, we talked about work. And in doing that, I then had this open space for people that I was meeting with to present themselves, their story, and for us to have an incredible organic yarn. Now, the word yarn is used quite, I'm going to acknowledge that it's used quite flippantly, I think, in some spaces. And sometimes people say, oh yeah, I'm having a yarn as a chat. And you can have a yarn as a chat, and a yarn can be a cup of tea and a chat. But so often, to have a yarn is a purpose, and it is setting up as a structure to do it safely together. It's also why I wanted to do it in this way, so I could actually go and see people, because to yarn in person, to yarn by fire, to yarn on country, this is about safe spaces. And it sets up a space to have the conversation where the narrative is then led by that space. What that meant though, even though I set it up this way and I had all this great intention and all this great, this is how it's going to be, I have 2 degrees and I live and breathe and work within Western institutions. And so the idea of doing something and going into my first yarn with no structure freaked me out. I was like, what am I doing? How is this going to work? What is this going to look like? Because even within family spaces, in my professional space, all I had known is Western ways of being, because that's what we do. And so I had this moment of oh, is this actually going to be whatever I actually wanted it to be? And then I sat down with them. And we were in this big conference room. And there was the jug of water and the glasses and all the things. And we were sitting down. And a Maori elder, Papa Doug, sat with me and he just went, don't think this is the right room. I was like, and the first day to this, I've travelled to Wellington. I'm like, yeah, cool, okay, where do you want it to go? And they're like, no, we need food, we need drink. And so we went downstairs, there was a cafe, we had an area, and they're like, yeah, we're gonna get the food, get the drink, this sort of thing. We moved everything around and we sat down and he was like, okay, we gotta drink, we gotta have food, do this, and then he goes, okay, now we can talk. And it was like I was back at that kitchen table. And all the kind of worry and fear and stress I had that this was going to be something completely melted away because I was enveloped in story. I was gifted story, I was gifted wisdom and knowledge, and it was done in a way that acknowledged the fact that we needed time and we needed a safe space. And anytime I penciled in a yarn, everyone always goes, oh yeah, we'll pencil it in, we'll put an hour. And I don't think I had a yarn that lasted less than 3 hours. Because every time we got into it, it was an acknowledgement of this is going to take as long as it takes. And that was also why I wanted to do it this way, so I could go and be, and I could kind of have days where all I had was one meeting with someone, but that turned into an entire day of yarning, of eating, of family, of going to people's houses and being introduced, and woven in was stories around sexual violence. And it was done in a way where we got there when we needed to. We were not rushed there. We did not jump to a space that was unsafe for people. We were able to sit and get to the tough bits and get to the knowledge in a warm handhold kind of way. So New Zealand was where I started. I had meetings with incredible people. Yarns and stories are the foundation of my research. And they're the foundation of how we as First Nations people share knowledge. It is different, as I said, than the surveys and the data collection, but it is no less important than how we exchange information. And as I said, I had to unpack my own bias with it. But New Zealand particularly helped me step out of the colonial institution mindset that I probably had still quite heavily as I started it. And midway through my travels in New Zealand, to me, as I envision it, it was as I stepped more and more outside of that Western space, as I really allowed myself to sink into the Indigenous ways of what I was doing. I was gifted this message and this knowing from my ancestors. It was after a particular yarn in Auckland with the amazing Professor TC, who again, it was one of those spaces where we met at a university and we were like in the situation, we were like, no, we need to leave and we need to be outside and we need to be on the ground and we need to just talk and talk and talk. And I left with this like buzz of energy afterwards, and I just got, as I said, gifted a knowing. It came into my consciousness, it came into my body, and it was this image, and I don't have it with me, but I took a notebook with me through my entire fellowship, and I have this image just like drawn consistently throughout it. And it's this basket. So it's not this exact basket, but a woven basket. And so I had this knowledge, and this is what I wrote down that moment. I was sitting outside, sun on me, and I knew these were just the words that had to come out. So I am the holder of gifts of knowledge, the witness to stories. My job is not to interfere, but to hold space for the gifts to play with each other. I am holding the woven basket full of gifts. I am overcome with emotion and pride for my ancestors. I feel them smiling on my journey. My journey is to walk, present my line, and hold gifts deemed worthy. This basket imagery would follow me throughout, as I said, the entire fellowship, and my research was underpinned by this knowing. Again, a knowing that I cannot quantify to you with a number or a footnote, but a knowing nonetheless. Language was the drum that really had that beat across my yarns. And language always left me feeling hopeful and grief-stricken. I do not have language. That was a thing that we have not yet reclaimed through our connection with Stolen Generation. When I first got on my flight to New Zealand and I heard the Te Reo Maori being spoken by the flight attendants, and like on the Air New Zealand, like just safety thing with like, here's the seatbelts and here's the, I like burst into tears. It was a stressful day. But every time I went into those spaces, how language was just used by everyone. It was not just Maori people speaking Te Reo Maori. It was done across. When I went into government spaces, language was used. And obviously it's very different, but every time it was that hope, but it felt so conflicted. And then when I was yarning with Jade, who's this photo up here, who's an incredible Maori academic based in Auckland, who was on maternity leave and met me at the beach. And I was explaining language to her, and she was like Lauren, you're experiencing grief. You're having this big moment of grief in your body. And for that second, again, that Western voice in my head went, but like, I don't have right to grief. It's not something I've lost. But it is something I've lost. And then even then, we had this whole conversation about the word lost, because I was like, it was not lost. It was intentionally removed and stopped me from having it. And so there's also then a different level of grief. And so throughout this process, like anytime we were around language, it was like it filled my cup so incredibly and it broke me so entirely, which was painful, but a key to being able to actually do the research as I was doing it. All right, slides. We always came back to this idea of, in New Zealand particularly, and as I started to travel, language but ceremony. And this idea of what did reclaiming ceremony mean, particularly for young people that have experienced harm, for communities that have experienced harm. And this is where we started to play with this idea of going, okay, well, outside of like carceral system or one-on-one therapy, what did healing after sexual violence look like for young people? And for us, we kept coming to, and I kept learning all these different ideas of ceremony that have always been done in community, and then speaking to people that have lost knowledge of ceremony, but going, we know there's something. We know the bones of a ceremony, and so, okay, how can we actually enact it and reclaim it? And it's so scary as a First Nations person to try and reclaim a ceremony that hasn't been done or shown to you. And working with elders and going, we have pieces of knowledge, but actually what would it look like to just step in and try? It's terrifying. But the people I spoke with had done that. They had started to reclaim that ceremony and they were seeing the outcomes with their young people. And so after sort of having this space of talking about language and ceremony, I was gifted into that basket another piece of knowing. And this was after a yarn with a particular academic who was someone that we met with food and drink, and she gifted me all this research and knowledge, and she kind of went, here's all the pieces of information, now let's stop talking about the information and let's actually sit here and connect. And so this was a particular knowing that came to me. She came to gift knowledge into the basket, but as the gifts intertwined and danced with the old knowledge, she felt the tug to bear witness. So she wrapped her arms around mine, so we both held the gifted stories and witnessed how they interacted with each other. We watched them weave new meaning and pull in old knowledge and create understanding, the beginning of understanding. Together we dive into the flow and hold the basket strong, fortifying its strength with our arms. The heavier the basket becomes, the more knowledge and idea dance together. The greater the need for those in its orbit to bear witness to its transformation. It needs to be known, it needs balance, and it needs more arms. And so I took this knowing with me as I jumped on a very long plane and went over to Canada. If New Zealand was like the meeting of the minds, then Canada and the United States was a meeting of the hearts. I was continuously invited into people's homes. And not only did we yarn about ceremony, but I was able to partake in ceremony. The Wheel of Wellness model kept popping up, and it was something that kept coming through, of this idea of kind of the spiritual, the physical, the emotional, and psychological well-being. And it kept coming up over and over in different conversations. And what I found fascinating was, as soon as I kind of crossed continents, the same stories that came through those yarns, unprompted by me, came up in future yarns. And it was like, if we think of that basket imagery, I felt like I was just weaving it slowly across. And every time we took something like a piece of string from one conversation, we wove it into the next one. And they wove it. I didn't. I was just kind of witnessing in that as it was woven together. Adding to this running thread of balance, what does it mean to heal, repair, and come back to balance? And I think when we think of Western institutions, the idea of balance is justice, and so punishment. And there's an idea of, well, if we've balanced the scales, we've punished someone that's harmed someone. But every time we sat in a yarn, we went, well, that isn't actually a balanced relationship. It does not balance the community. This eye for an eye idea doesn't actually do what we want it to do. And actually what it does is it means if we as the community have punished someone for a harm, we as the community have now done a harm. And we often then, and depending on what that punishment looked like, it was an idea of, okay, well now we as the community have done harm, we as the community are out of balance. And so this idea of balance kept coming back and going, well, you can't heal, and healing without balance is really difficult. And so during ceremonies, I was able to witness what healing looked like firsthand, how elders created an environment and used ancient knowledge to offer safety for young people, not to magically take away trauma. It's not how it works. As healing isn't about removing or ignoring pain. My first sweat lodge that I partook in outside of Toronto was such an incredible representation of the Wheel of Wellness, because it was one of the most extreme moments I was pushed, not just physically, though my body has never produced that amount of sweat before in my entire life, but mentally. If you're unfamiliar with a sweat lodge, there are 4 rounds of heat and steam, and each gets increasingly more intense in temperature. While you were allowed to leave the sweat lodge after any round, you were not allowed to come back in afterwards. So you either go through all 4 or you have to remove yourself, but you can't come back in. So getting through all 4 was a mental battle. It's a physical, the sweat, but it's actually going, can I continue to sit here and go through these rounds? The emotions shared through each round, we all held together in the space. One particular round, you go around and you actually just verbalize whatever needs to come out in that sweat and steam. It is pitch black in there. There is a singer and drummer who sing and drum the entire way through, which is incredible because I could barely speak in that heat. but the space they created meant that everyone shared it and we held it together. The stories and traumas that emerged, particularly around sexual violence, with only the steam and the drum to guide us, were not as heavy because all our hands were there and we held it together. Spiritually, I felt the ceremony broke and mended me, and it was one of the hardest things I've experienced, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. If you are ever invited into a sweat lodge, do it. It's going to be great. And so, this is it. There we go. Look at me go. Slides. Okay, then I went to Norway. And Norway was the place where everyone in Australia most thought would be like leading the way. Everyone was like, oh, you're going to Norway, they're going to have all the answers, you're going to get there and it's going to be like this incredible moment. And it was incredible for so many reasons. It makes sense as an assumption. Their Indigenous Parliament has been standing for 30 years, and it is something that we definitely do not have here. And how they set up this space, and when you walked in, like when you go to Norway and go to that Sami Parliament, it's incredible. It is such an Indigenous space. It has an Indigenous library full of Indigenous knowledge. And it, like, you walk in and it's just this like incredible like spiral sphere space, and it's overwhelming. It's where I witnessed a potential possibility for our people in Australia. I spent days in the Sami Parliament meeting with young Sami with dreams of an open and embraced culture. I spoke with older Parliament members who recognised that their Parliament is a space that needed decolonising work. As incredible a building as it was, when I sat in the plenary sessions that were happening in the Parliament, it was like being in Canberra. It was an Indigenous Parliament that ran like a Western Parliament. For lots of reasons, one of the biggest being they had to work with the Norwegian Parliament and government. And so to be respected, again, as Indigenous people, we adopted the Westernised language and systems. And so they were using language to present themselves in a colonised manner. They looked on at us and how free we are with culture. I saw the yearning for ceremony, and in all of the yarns I had, there was such a yearning from young Sami of going, we do not have safe spaces to perform ceremony. The racism that they face in Norway, look, there was lots of similarities. And so while they have this incredible parliament, they do not have the answers that we assumed they would. For safe spaces to connect and proudly be Indigenous, it was all private, it was all in homes, and none of it could be done in public. They wanted to experience all emotions, not just those deemed polite by their colonised government. And the idea of politeness was a running theme we had. So I only have, again, relatively short amount of time. I'm aware of time and all the things. So please come and have a yarn with me afterwards if you would like to. Because across the board, as I said, there was one thing I kept coming back to, and this idea across my yarns was this idea of, okay, well, what would our recipe be? Because again, like at that kitchen table, food is what I kept coming back to. And so across my yarns, the one thing I asked continuously was, what ingredient do we need for healing? What is the space? What is the ingredient list that we need for healing? And so much of it is not news to us. But in my report, I have a section at the end that actually lists the recipe and lists every single point that anyone that I spoke to said that we needed to heal. And so often we kept coming back to this idea that you cannot heal if you are not safe. You cannot be safe if there is not cultural safety and space for you. You cannot be safe if you have to be polite, and you cannot be safe if you do not have knowing. And so throughout the conversation, there was three particular, because again, Western model, but there were three particular threads in that woven basket that were the loudest for me. And so the first of that was knowledge. And this is not knowledge in the way that we often think about it, which is like knowledge of other, of being given knowledge, even though that's what happened for me. It was actually kept coming back to an idea of knowing oneself. knowing one's story, knowing your family story, your history, but your story and knowledge around sexual violence, understanding how that looks in your history. And we kept coming back to this idea of, we love to talk about intergenerational trauma. And it's like quite a big word we keep coming back to. And so we kept flipping it and going, okay, well, if you have no knowledge of your intergenerational strengths, and in all the yarns I had, we kept talking about when the people that I was meeting that worked with sexual violence, when they were working with victims and perpetrators, they would sit down and go like, do you know, like, what is the story you know of yourself, of your family, of your history? And when we started to, and we go back through, okay, you've stepped over protocol, but you never knew the protocol was there in the first place. And so, okay, there's this piece that to have true healing, what is knowledge? What is knowing oneself? And anytime I work in rural regional spaces and in community, there is such an understanding of what community means to knowing. And anytime I'm in big cities, there's a real disconnect of what community means to knowing. And so this idea of knowledge was really important. The idea of balance, and this is that other thing we kept coming back to, this idea that carceral response and an individualistic response is not balanced, and it doesn't actually understand that there are three pieces to sexual violence. And these words can be kind of interchanged with others, but for this context, it's about victim, perpetrator, but community goes around it. And so every space I worked into, they would talk about if you only have responses, services for victim or perpetrator, it is not balanced. If you have them for both, it is like having two wings of an eagle with no body. Can't do much. And so when I was speaking in these communities, they would tell me the community's the body. Community needs to guide and be the body and kind of have those two spaces of victim, of perpetrator. And if both of these people cannot come back to community, then again, it is not balanced. It can't create healing. And this is where we often come to this idea of what does punishment, what does excluding of community look like? Because if they've been excluded from community, there is no then incentive to have accountability and healing within what has been happened, because there's no space to come back to. And so we kept coming, okay, well, so you need a space that is about victim, perpetrator, but it's about community surrounding it. And to do true healing, you need to have recognition of ceremony. And ceremony needs to play this incredibly important role, which it's always done, but within this context is to play a role of going, ceremony is about recognising, often, transformation. And so this is about ceremony that recognises that you have done harm. There's ceremony we need to do of the recognition that you've actually stepped outside of yourself and outside of community. There needs to be a recognition and step of a victim who has also had harm. But we as a community need to do ceremony for the fact that we as the community are now harmed. We are hurting, there is grief. Okay, what is the recognition points? And then you build. Because again, you need things to build for. So what are the ceremony recognitions that actually go, we're recognising your healing journey, we're recognising the accountability, we're recognising the steps you're making back into us. As I said, this is not the whole of all of the things because of time. Now it's like 25,000 words. But the report of my entire fellowship that has kind of a very in-depth unpacking of my journey and my recommendations and what this all looks like is coming out like this week. Is it out today? No. But it is coming out this week. And so if you would like to read it, please let me know. I will obviously send it all through and it can go out when it comes out. Thank you so much for having me with you this morning. Thank you for sitting with what can sometimes be uncomfortable coexistence between your study knowledge and your feeling knowledge. So thank you for sitting with that with me. And thank you for stepping into my kitchen with me, and thank you for stepping into sun with me. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your conference. I will be here for the 2 days, so please come up and have a chat whenever you like. Thank you, Sesh, for all the incredible work you do and the partnerships that we have had over the years. And now go have morning tea. Thank you.